Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, and welcome to another Oxus Society's Twitter Space, this time examining the parliamentary elections out of Kazakhstan. But unfortunately, Twitter Spaces is not being too helpful tonight and not letting our speakers speak, so we've had to pre-record this one and play it for you. But it is very fresh off the press. We've only recorded about half an hour ago. And the topic for tonight's discussion is, as I said earlier on, the Kazakh parliamentary elections. Now, we haven't seen all the results come back yet, but we have seen some exit polls come back, which have given some really interesting results, including a massive loss of vote share for Amanat. This will also be the first time in a very long time we've seen independents running in Kazakh elections. And by the looks of it, we are likely to see some of these independents enter the parliament in this session. So a lot to talk about tonight and a lot to cover for an election that may set the tone for Kazakh politics for the next few years. And we have a fantastic panel with us tonight. Joining us is Bruce Pannier, the famous Central Asia journalist, who barely needs an introduction, a good friend of the show here, as well as Catherine Putz, who is the amazing managing editor for the Diplomat, and another great friend of the show here. So, we've just seen these elections. We haven't got the full results yet, but we have got some early exit polls. Bruce, what are we learning from these elections? What's your first impression of what's coming back?
The people of Kazakhstan are a lot less interested in the political reforms and the promises of President Tokayev that we're going to have a second republic. Barely more than half of the eligible voters took the time to go cast ballots. So kind of disappointing that there was such a low level of political activity on election day.
Katie, was there anything from this election that did surprise you a bit?
I think obviously the introduction of independent candidates is an interesting feature. I think it will need more information before we'll see if it rises to the level of surprising quite yet. But it is an interesting addition. But I think, like Bruce said, there's a lot more to be done to convince the Kazakh people that this electoral process is one that they have an influence in. And we see that in the turnout number.
I mean, obviously, it's not a huge change, if we zoom out quite far, but there are, some changes towards, what it was in 2021 to what it is now. Bruce, can you take us through what is different between the last time they ran these parliamentary elections, which was 2021?
Well, the first thing is the absence of former President Nursultan Nazarbayev from Kazakhstan's politics. I mean, everything that happened since he's been president, but even when he stepped down, there was a lot of suspicions that the whole process and the government was being run still by Nazarbayev, and that Kassym-Jomart Tokayev was nothing more than a figurehead. So there's that element that these elections are purely his elections, to fill the government, pretty much hopefully in line with what he hopes to do going forward. But also as Katie mentioned, the fact that there was independent candidates. We haven't seen independent candidates run since the 2004 parliamentary elections. So instead of being just purely, options of pro-government / pro-presidential candidates to vote for, you did have the possibility to vote in 29 districts, and that's 29 out of 98 seats. But in 29 districts, you could actually vote for someone who you thought represented your particular interest, as opposed to, like I said, just a member of another party. So that was a hopeful incremental step. We'll see how it pans out once the election results are released, and whether any of these independent candidates actually won any seats. But it was an interesting and probably necessary start to some kind of inclusive process for the people.
So, Katie, how independent are these candidates? Are they, is this the beginning of an actual opposition inside Kazakhstan, or are these candidates really, cut from the same cloth, but slightly different to what we've had before?
I think it's kind of hard to judge. So there were 435 self-nominated and party-nominated candidates for those 29 seats. The majority of those were self-nominated, and these people run the entire gamut. There is, however, the limiting factor. I can't remember the exact figure, but there was a fairly high threshold financially to enter. So I think that has to be taken into consideration. And then the fact that the election period was 1 month long. It's not very long to cut through the noise and sort of get your name out there and get the kind of name recognition that would get you a majority of votes. I think one figure worth pointing out is that, in Astana, there were two of these districts. One had 41 candidates for a single seat. So imagine walking into the polling booth and there's a list of 41 names, most of which you've never heard of. I think that gives you kind of a picture of the ability to choose. But there was a variety. I think there were some truly independent candidates trying to contest these seats, and the real question is going to be, one, whether they're able to win in those seats, and then what kind of effect they're going to be able to have in the legislature in terms of actually raising issues. One seat out of 98 is not a lot of power. And so that's where the power of being in a party comes in and having a faction. If these individual candidates all act as individual seats, then they're just going to add to the noise. If there's some kind of effort to bring them together and kind of back joint positions, I think that could get interesting. But we're going to have to see who wins these seats. And I've seen some complaints because they haven't announced most of these seats yet. And we'll have to see how that pans out in terms of who actually wins these seats and then what they do with those seats.
Obviously, it's still quite early in the night. We don't know exactly how many seats are going to be distributed, but from the exit polls, we're seeing that Amanat, which is the president's party, is getting about 53% of the vote. Next down is IOL, which is it's a very farmers party, which took home 11% of the vote. That's a huge jump up from the last election. Bruce, are they likely to play a larger role in politics now that they have 11% of the vote and probably a somewhat sizable constituency inside the Majlis?
A larger role in the sense that, as you pointed out, they have more seats. So, they who knows, they might even start introducing legislation or something. The fact that all 7 of the parties that participated in this election were all, again, pro-government parties, supporters of President Tokayev, it really doesn't matter that much how the seats are distributed among them. Amanat still keeps its majority in parliament, but there's been 3 parties. The same 3 parties have been in parliament since 2012, and there really hasn't been any infighting or disagreement over policy, and that's just going to continue. I mean, that's why I noticed right away Amanat, of course, has far less seats than it had in previous parliaments, but considering all the parties are supporters of Tokayev. It really, it's just a different name for the same kind of deputy, essentially. You're from one party instead of the other, but you're going to vote the same way and go along with this. So I don't see that makes really any difference at all. Like I said, they'll have the second most amount of seats, but they'll vote the same way as Amanat, and the other parties are going to vote.
Katie, obviously that's not the only party that's taken seats tonight. We have in the People's Party, we have a few smaller ones. We even have Respublica, which there was a lot of sort of talk about in the blog sphere that they might be able to do a bit of an upset. Are any of these parties, I know they are pro-government, but a different way of doing Kazakh politics, or are these just arms of the same thing?
I mean, judging from the campaign, they seem to all be much of the same. I think I would agree with Bruce on that measure. I sound like a broken record, but we're going to have to see what they do. If these parties continue to vote unanimously, all in favor of sort of government proposals, then that's your answer. I think there's certainly the opportunity for these parties to actually introduce legislation that fits what they say their platforms are. But most of these parties all have very similar platforms. I think one thing worth remarking about the election is you can't really pick out like a single big issue that was a campaign issue that a lot of candidates hit on, even though I think as analysts we can think of what the big campaign issues should have been, but I think we're going to have to see what they do with those seats. But I would agree with Bruce. It doesn't necessarily tell us anything because so far what these parties have done while in the legislature is vote along with Amanat. So there's not much of a difference. So there's always the opportunity, but they're going to have to see some initiative on the part of these parties to strike out their own platforms and their own policy positions. And I think that's a really big hurdle.
So when we look at the election results, the exit polls are suggesting that about 53% of the vote went to Amanat, which is the president's party. But when he went to the presidential election recently, he took home 83% of memory serves of the vote. Is this an indication that he's more popular in the party, or is there something we should read from this, Bruce? Or is this just the fact that there's more competition in the parliamentary elections than there is in the presidential ones?
Yeah, I mean, I think the latter point you made is the one is correct here, that there was more competition, and this was, you hate to say it's stage managed, although I really there's no other way to look at this. I think it creates the illusion that there's a pluralistic system in place here, that there's a number of different interests that are being represented in the government. You pointed out Aul is an agriculturally based party, whereas Respublika, the newcomer, is always seen as a business party, right? The party of businessmen or something. So you have this. You've taken different segments of the population and given them, at least on face value, a party that's supposed to speak their, for their interest, those interests. But at the end of the day, again, it doesn't really make any difference because everyone's on board with the same plan. They're just spokesmen for different aspects of that plan, I suppose. So, but it does, like I said, you got 5, 6 parties that get in. If you didn't know much about Kazakhstan, you'd say, well, great, look at that. Whereas I think in Tokayev's case, it was more necessary that he had a kind of a more overwhelming mandate for himself, just to show that he was the sole person at the top of this. It's easier to distribute the places lower down.
Katie, obviously Tokayev has pushed back not hugely on Russia and the conflict, but they still have been more vocal about pushing back on this than I think any of I think Tokayev's predecessor might have been. How was that difference in messaging gone in particularly Russia-heavy cities like Petropavl? Are we looking at a different way of voting out there, or are they voting pretty much the same way the rest of the country is?
I'm sorry to admit this, but I don't actually have the information to answer that question well. I think that's an interesting question, and we should certainly look at if that influenced anybody's votes. But I think, as I noted, when we look at the campaign more broadly, that wasn't a big issue of discussion. And I, my opinion is that it should have been. Certainly Kazakhstan's relationship with Russia is a big issue for Kazakhstan and for the Kazakh people. That should have been a big issue in terms of debate between different parties and candidates, and which trajectory should we take. And we didn't see that. So I don't know the answer to that particular question. Maybe Bruce does, but it's an important one. I just don't know if that will quite break through, which does sort of reveal a little bit of the facade of this election.
Bruce, any insights to this one on how the Russian-heavy areas in Kazakhstan would vote?
Yeah, I've been trying to find some reports that spoke about how they voted. I mean, so all I got is really anecdotal from my trips through Kazakhstan. Is that in the 1990s when I was there, the Russian population did vote a lot in the north, as far as I could tell. I mean, they really did. But whether it was going through the motions of politics because that carried over from the Soviet Union, or I don't know, but they did turn out. But that kind of gradually faded away. And so I haven't noticed the last 10 or 15 years when I've been going through Kazakhstan that the Russian segment, ethnic Russian segment of the population, particularly up north, was that enthused about politics at all. And in fact, a lot of them seemed to try to just stay out of the way of it. They didn't want to get messed up and entangled in domestic Kazakh politics because they were afraid of what that could do to them if they were siding with the wrong party or something. So I would imagine that the turnout among ethnic Russians was probably pretty low, just because they aren't going to see that there's anything on this in this parliamentary elections that really is a benefit or a detriment to them. There's nothing in particular that addresses their specific needs. And like I said, in the 1990s, it was different. They were also more active because there were Russian groups, so some secessionists, but anyway, Russian groups that were speaking out to make sure that they kept the rights for ethnic Russians in the north. But that's gone, more than 20 years later. So but like I said, it's only anecdotal, but my impression has always been that they try to keep a low profile. They probably weren't very enthused about anything in particular with this election.
Katie, you have any follow-ups on that?
Yes. So I just took the opportunity to look at least the turnout in some of these regions, and you have some fairly high turnouts in northern Kazakhstan regions. So the North Kazakhstan region was apparently 65%, which is above the average for the country. You also have in Pavlodar 58% 0.6. So you have some higher turnouts, which might reflect some of what Bruce was mentioning, just sort of this Soviet style, like everybody lines up and goes to the polling place. And so, you might see higher turnout, but I don't know what kind of conclusion we can quite draw from that yet. I would have loved to see, and I would love to see reporting from those cities. But I think this also reflects one of the issues in covering this election is the ability of independent observers and journalists to really report on these things. I was not able to travel to Kazakhstan, though I did have the opportunity to go. I think, the turnout is maybe what we should discuss next, but I think that's part of that answer to your question.
Well, if you have the turnout data there in front of you, obviously the major story that I'm seeing here is that Almaty only had about 12% turnout. Are there any regions of Kazakhstan that have had particularly high turnouts?
So Almaty is about 25%, which is drastically low. Let's see, North Kazakhstan is 65%, Zhambul is 65, Kostany 65, East Kazakhstan 64, and then you have Akmola, which is where the capital is at 60. Almaty region is 60, so I think that's kind of interesting between Almaty city and Almaty region. Astana was 42, and so you have a good range, but it's clear like Almaty in terms of the city, really low turnout, even in as far as any elections in the world go. 25% is really low, and I think that says something about the understanding or the belief on the part of Kazakh voters that their vote matters. If you don't think your vote matters, you don't bother to turn up to the poll. And so I think that's what that says to me. I'd be curious what that says to Bruce.
So yeah, Bruce, obviously this is the first time in Kazakhstan we've seen a lot of election campaign posters and whatnot around the city, and particularly in Almaty. Are you surprised by this really low turnout, or is this kind of bound to happen?
Yeah, I mean, I am kind of surprised because I would have thought there would have been a lot more, and we still got to see. I'll be curious to know how many people voted, when they voted on party lists, which were 69 of the 98 seats. How many of them just either didn't vote or voted against everybody, as compared to like the single mandate districts, and how many people actually voted for, voted in those. I would bet that more people voted in the single mandate districts. The percentage was higher than it was for party lists. But again, we'll have to wait and see how the figures pan out. But I thought that the introduction or reintroduction of independent candidates would have sparked a lot more interest. And I'm not saying it didn't; it probably did. But again, the general low turnout across the country was surprising to me, because I would have thought that people would have been at least willing to test it. But it shows, I guess, kind of the cynical attitude a lot of people have gained toward elections in Kazakhstan over the years, of that it just doesn't matter, and not being prodded to the election polls by anybody. They simply chose not to vote at all. So that was, like I said, it was disappointing, but it was also surprising. I thought they would have at least gotten 2/3 of the electorate to come out for that one, but didn't work out that way.
Do you think that's because there's been some people who haven't been able to register their party? I mean, as a particular case, sort of Inga Imamova was not able to register a party. The Democratic Party of Kazakhstan hasn't been able to register their party. If those guys had been able to register, do you think it would have seen a massive showing by particularly Almaty, or there just is political apathy at the moment? No one's particularly enthusiastic about any of the candidates.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. If they had genuine opposition parties that were registered and could have competed, across the board, not only in single mandate districts, but on the party list system, I think it would have got a lot more people interested to come out and cast their ballots, cast some votes. I think that's a real mistake, and especially it's all the more glaring of a mistake when you consider that the two parties that were admitted, Baitak and the Respublika Party, were registered in record time, at the end of last year, whereas some of these parties, Alga Kazakhstan and the Democratic Movement of Kazakhstan, Democratic Party of Kazakhstan, excuse me, and some others have been trying to register for years, 10, 12, more times than that, and didn't get in. And all of a sudden, these two unknown groups just, breezed right through. I mean, that tends to make you even more sour people even more on the possibilities of Kazakhstan's political system when they see stuff like that happen, and know that these parties that have been trying for years, that really are opposition parties, and maybe do have some alternative ideas, something new and fresh, just can't get in, and the pro-government parties get fast-tracked right in just to give the appearance that there's more parties registered, and there's more of a choice for the voters on election day. So,
Katie, if we do see a lot of independents get up tonight and get into Parliament here, are we likely to see that as the beginning of an opposition inside Kazakhstan?
It's possible, if you have, say, an independent candidate who enters parliament and introduces a piece of legislation and gives like a good speech that goes viral, you could see the beginning of a political movement around that person. But this is kind of the downfall of independent candidates, is they're single candidates. So unless they can kind of band together, which is difficult, if you have the panache and the interest in sort of running for an individual mandate seat, you might not necessarily be so interested in subsuming your personality politics into a larger party, and so you might see sort of the wolves all eating each other. I think it is worth watching to see if any of the independent candidates use their election to form a political movement and then register a party, and then if they're allowed to register a party, because as Bruce pointed out, we had these two new parties, but they kind of came out of nowhere. We don't know terribly. They have sort of introduced themselves and a certain platform, but we don't know that much about what it is that they're going to do or the personalities behind them. They're sort of their names on paper at this point, and so I think we'll have to see. There's certainly the opportunity for that, but the question is whether the state is going to allow that. Individuals like Jana Blatmame, who I think was released on house arrest late last year, but is facing charges. His Democratic Party of Kazakhstan hasn't been able to be registered for years, but he's an individual who people know. And so, politics revolves around individuals in that kind of way. Name recognition is an important part of basically every democratic election. And so if an independent candidate can convert their own seat into creating some kind of block, then maybe you see the beginning of an actual opposition movement. But again, the heavy caveat is will the government allow this to happen, or not? Because there have been attempts at genuine opposition parties in the last 30 years in Kazakhstan, and none of them have been successful very long because they've all been shut down in one way or another. And so I think that's a history that these individual candidates know. So I think there might be some self-censorship and some policing of their own behavior to find that path in which they can have some degree of influence, but not push too hard and get sort of knocked out of the system. But I hope that somebody tests the system and tries to do something meaningful with their seat, but they might not. Plenty of politicians are not exactly as altruistic as they'd like us to believe. So we'll have to see what they do with those seats once they have them.
Obviously, there are lots of independent candidates, and you can't paint them all with the same brush. But, half my brain when I think independence, I think someone like Vladimir Zelensky, who came out of pretty much nowhere in politics. The other half of me thinks about an almost Michael Bloomberg character who is rich enough to fund his own campaign. Which category do you think most of the independents sit in when it comes to Kazakhstan, Bruce?
Oh, that's a good question. You mentioned Inga Imanbay. Now, here's someone who's clearly a politician. Her husband, of course, is Shambalat Mamai. But so you do have those. You have people who are from opposition parties, or at least very politically active, and would like to like their candidacy and hopefully their election to be a spark for a greater movement. But then again, you're going to get a lot of people who are just out for local interests and local appeal. And I'm not saying that's bad. If you had somebody who was an independent candidate and won a seat, and they were genuinely interested in representing the interest of their constituents, and this is a good thing. Even if that's all the further their vision was, then just my district, my province, whatever, I need to fix this kind of stuff up. That would be absolutely fine. And I suspect you're going to get kind of a mixture of that. But again, we'll see what happens when the results come out. I would be willing to bet that more than half of those 29 seats are going to go to people who are from the registered political parties who were running in those districts. So it's tough to say which truly independent candidate might actually win, and on what basis people would have voted for them.
Katie, let's say we have an actually truly independent candidate sitting in probably the Almaty 3rd district, and they really do start to get some traction. They start to actually make some speeches against the government. Are the local press likely to pick that up, and is he likely to get traction and almost begin an opposition, or is it going to be something that doesn't really go anywhere because none of the local press will pick it up?
I mean, I think you would certainly see some coverage. So Vlast, for example, is a really good Kazakh media outlet. I think they would cover someone who would be genuinely interesting, but there's not a lot, and I think this is one of the things the OSCE pointed out in their preliminary report on the election, is that there's still not a lot of independent media coverage. TV is almost entirely state controlled or at least state affiliated. And so, I think there would be some coverage, but not necessarily a tremendous amount. And so that is part of the hampering of developing a political movement is people need to know that you exist. And the only way people know you exist is if you're able to reach them. That said, I think one thing to look at is the power of social media and the sort of circumventing of traditional media formats. Traditional media formats are all controlled by the government. There's plenty of other ways to reach people. And so I think that's where you might see some of that activity, your Facebooks, your Twitter, your Instagrams, those kinds of formats reach Kazakh voters in a way that state media don't do a great job of. And so it's possible, but there's, the media atmosphere in Kazakhstan has been under pressure. And so again, like candidates sort of knowing where the boundaries are, I think media are also aware of where the boundaries are. And so you might see some hesitation to cover a truly independent candidate sort of going out on their own.
So, Bruce, now effectively we're not going to have another parliamentary election for a few years. Tokayev isn't up for presidential election for 2029 now. He's got his yard arm cleared. He can do what he wants now. He has a mandate from the people, as that's what the narrative will be. What options, what incentives do you think he is going to pursue going forward now that he has this Kazakh populist backing from the electorate here?
Well, the first thing I'd say is it would be pretty bold to predict that we're not going to have parliamentary elections for a few years in Kazakhstan, since they've so seldom held any election in that country on schedule. You just never know with that country. But as far as his new mandate, in this new parliament, certainly he has plans. He's unencumbered by Nursultan Nazarbayev, his predecessor. It means he's the guy now, right? That's going to lead this country forward. He says he has great ideas and he knows how to move Kazakhstan forward. And I suppose pretty soon we'll hear some grand sounding plan that he's willing to unveil. But what I would mention was him and the interior minister had a lot of ominous comments in the days leading up to this election about new laws that would bring harsher punishment to people who called for mass unrest or the overthrow of the government or something. And it was such a strange time to bring that up with parliamentary elections coming up. It was almost like a warning, and then Tokayev said, I'm not going to announce the initiatives until after the elections. And then he proceeded to say, there's these things we're not going to tolerate from people. The people want security and stability in their country. They don't want people fomenting problems. And so we're going to, initiate harsher punishments for people who do it. Why did that have to be mentioned? If he's supposed to be the architect of a second republic for Kazakhstan, these elections that he has, the changes in the constitution, all supposed to bring about a better, more prosperous Kazakhstan. And yet at the same time, he has to warn people that if you get out of line, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. So I'd like to think he has a good plan. And like I said, I'm sure that we're going to hear it soon, and that it'll be, something. Like I said, Nazarbayev long ago had his 2020 plan, and that became the 2030 plan. And the leaders of Central Asia are famous for coming up with a plan with some kind of name or title. So I'm sure we'll hear that soon, and we'll see what his direction is. But again, when you have to warn your people that you're going to get locked up or face real tough tough justice, if you step out of line, it doesn't make me optimistic about what he has in store for the country.
So, Katie, we're going to start to bring this to a bit of a wrap now, but who do you reckon are the big winners? Who are the losers from tonight? And do you think Tokayev is sitting at home tonight happy with the result that's come through?
I think Tokayev is a winner in this. I mean, the election went off. It comes out with what looks on the surface to be a larger number of parties in Parliament. There will be these 29 individual seats. And so there's a lot of ability to discuss this as a moment of opening without there being concrete evidence of those reforms being effective. Like Bruce and I have said time and again, we're going to have to see what they do with these seats and what these parties do in Parliament before you can sort of call this a democratic victory. But I think Tokayev is probably pretty content, as you discussed. He has secured his presidency. He has a parliament which is still filled with pro-government parties. There wasn't a lot of contentious debate during the campaign about touchy issues. There wasn't these big discussions about investigations into the January events. There weren't these big discussions about the war in Ukraine or Kazakhstan's energy problems. But these are things that are going to come up. And so I think part of that warning that Bruce was mentioning is about these issues. And I don't know if Tokayev necessarily has a plan for them, but I think one to watch in particular is the energy issue, the issue of blackouts. The winter was particularly bad this year, as it was the previous year. And obviously we're moving into spring now. But next winter, if you continue to see tremendous energy shortages and issues in that vein, the Kazakh electorate has a right to look at its government and say, like, what are you doing about these issues that affect me personally? But you don't have an electoral mechanism on the horizon to correct that course. So it will all come down to Tokayev. And then there's a lot of issues that are out of Tokayev's control that could be massive spoilers. Obviously, the war in Ukraine is one. Tokayev doesn't have control over any end of that conflict, but certainly has to deal with the fallout. And so I think that's something the Kazakh people will be looking to their government to make decisions on and to chart a course that is beneficial to them. But again, that's difficult to do. And so I think there's a lot of hesitation. There's a lot of concern, but there's not a lot of discussion about creative policies or how to deal with these hot button issues. And it's not going to make them go away. It just sort of removes the ability to discuss them. So we shall see.
And Bruce, I feel like I either open or end with this question with you every time we do a panel on Kazakhstan, but is this beginning of a new move toward democracy, and is this a move in the right direction, or this is just a stagnant problem and this is not really a massive shift in any direction for Kazakh politics?
Yeah, I don't think this is going to be a shift toward democracy. I'm not sure if he would do that, even if Tokayev was free to do whatever he wanted with Kazakhstan at this point. And why don't I think that it'll be a massive shift toward democracy is because I think he's got too much external pressure from his neighbors at the moment to have to let things go. He's got China and their campaign in Xinjiang against Muslims there, and he's got Russia and as a neighbor and to the north, and their war in Ukraine. And neither one of those countries are going to stand by and watch Tokayev create a hugely democratic Kazakhstan. Not that I expect he would open the floodgates and let everything go. Like I said, it's been measured. Even again with the independent candidates, this is incremental. It's a small step in the direction he's talking about. But I don't see him making any big jumps simply because it upsets the status quo in the foreign policy equation in that area. And I think China and Russia would be extremely upset if he started loosening the reins on power, bringing in more democratic reforms, and courting better ties, obviously, which would accompany that with democratic countries. So he's not totally free to do as he wishes. I won't say what he would do if he could, but I don't see that this is going to lead to a big democratic transformation in Kazakhstan anytime soon.
Well, a massive thank you to both Katie Putz, who's the managing editor at the Diplomat, and Bruce Pannier, who's a very, very famous journalist covering Central Asia for a long time now. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on talking about the recent elections in Kazakhstan, the parliamentary ones. We haven't got the results as yet, but it does look like Amanat will take back the majority of the seats at about 53% of the vote. It's been an absolute pleasure being with you tonight, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Thanks for tuning in.